Who'd have thought it? Exactly 2 years after the first lockdown, and the UK is on the verge of hitting record levels of COVID cases. More than 4 million people had the virus last week, and that number continues to climb. The new variant, BA2, is spreading very fast around the world, but hospital numbers remain relatively low. So does it matter anymore? I'll be joined this morning by the Education Secretary, Nadhim Zahawi. Was closing schools during the pandemic a mistake? And what is he doing to help pupils recover now? I've been speaking to America's most senior doctor, Anthony Fauci, who's been advising the president. Where does he see the pandemic heading? And will we ever know the truth about where it came from?
Well, I don't want to use the word lockdowns. That has a charged element to it. But I believe that we must keep our eye on the pattern of what we're seeing with infections.
Labour's Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary Jonathan Ashworth will be here to talk about the Chancellor's spring budget. And two men dominating the front pages this morning. One of them, President Biden, says Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. And Prince William's statement overnight after his Caribbean tour about his relationship with the Commonwealth. We'll talk about all of that with the historian and author of a new book on Russia, Sir Anthony Beevor, and the editor-in-chief of The Sun, Victoria Newton. But first, a summary of the news with Victoria Fritz.
Thanks, Sophie. The White House has denied that President Biden has called for a regime change in Russia. Mr. Biden told an audience in Poland that President Putin was bent on violence in Ukraine and that he could not be allowed to remain in power. The Kremlin insisted it was for Russians to choose their leaders. Now, a day after the Russian military said it would focus on eastern Ukraine, missiles have struck various targets in the west of the country, including the city of Lviv. Local officials said that 5 civilians were hurt when a fuel depot and a military factory were hit yesterday. The mayor said a nearby school was damaged also by shrapnel. The Duke of Cambridge has said that the future relationship between the UK and Belize, Jamaica and the Bahamas is for their people to decide. He said that he and the Duchess were committed to service and that for us, that's not telling people what to do. Prince William's comments come after an 8-day tour in the Caribbean nations to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. And in Formula One, it was a dreadful qualifying session for Lewis Hamilton. The 7-time world champion will start in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix back in 16th place. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Sophie.
Victoria, thank you very much. Let's have a look at the front pages this morning, and we can start with the Mail on Sunday. William, I may not rule the Commonwealth is their headline there, and that's after his extraordinary statement at the end of the Caribbean tour. The headline there is their interpretation of his statement, what he said. The Sunday Mirror as well leading on that. Wills let the people decide. The shock statement on the Caribbean tour, it says. The Sunday Telegraph leading with Joe Biden and his words yesterday when he gave that speech in Warsaw. For God's sake, this man can't remain in power. And it says the US policy is in chaos as Biden calls for Putin to be deposed. But as you just heard, the White House has backtracked on that one. The Observer's headline as well, Biden, butcher Putin cannot be allowed to stay in power. The Sunday Times focusing on the Chancellor's spring statement. Panicking number 10, it says, plans another energy handout after a backlash over Rishi Sunak's statement sparks a rethink and also humbled William. We won't talk down to you. Their headline, the Sunday Express, again on the mini statement, solve the cost of living crisis or you'll lose the election, says the Sunday Express. And the Sun on Sunday has news of the Queen's new mobile, the £60,000 golf buggy for trips out. Well, joining me this morning to review the papers are the historian and author, Sir Anthony Beevor, and editor-in-chief of The Sun newspaper, Victoria Newton. Good morning to both of you. Let's start with Prince William. That is the new news overnight, the statement that was released very late. What do you make of it all?
Well, it's extraordinary to get a senior royal such as William to speak out in this way, and also to take head on some of the criticism that they've faced on this tour, which has been slightly unprecedented. It shows how much he's maturing into this role. I'm not sure his father would have taken on criticism so well, and I think you can see it's a prince who's grappling with the future of the monarchy and that burden he has on his shoulders.
And that's Richard Kay's point in the Mail today, isn't it? That it's very. He also says they would not have liked this criticism at all. It will have stung them deeply.
That's right. I mean, William and Catherine are both massively professional, perfectionists, and I would think they'd have a right to feel slightly let down that they were put in that position, certainly with the famous picture of them reaching out. To be fair to them, I think Diana probably would have done exactly the same thing. The children were calling out for them. It just perhaps was an unfortunate situation that they were put in there.
And then there was the open-top vehicle as well.
Yes, many people said this reeked of old-fashioned colonialism, and it was obviously meant as a tribute to the Queen, who'd done a similar thing years and years earlier, but it was perhaps a little unfortunate that they were again put in that position. So I think it's really mature of William to come out and say what he said, and it's perhaps a sign of the type of king he will be in the future.
How do you think it's happened, though? Because it's unusual to see them I can't remember them getting this much sort of negative publicity in that sense for a long time.
That's right. I mean, they basically haven't put a foot wrong. They've been incredible during the pandemic. They've reassured the public. They've done things that politicians just can't do, and they are so popular. And just to balance some of the criticism they had there, the majority of the public there were welcoming them with opening arms. But yes, it will be a little bit of a shock to them.
It's the optics, isn't it? It's just those images. I mean, Anthony, what do you think?
A couple of bad photo opportunities, and it can undo all the good that you've achieved otherwise. Yeah.
And it's about thinking about that behind the scenes before it actually happens, like the photograph, as you were just saying, with the wire mesh.
These tours get planned way in advance, and I would think he will be hoping that his team learn from this and don't make a similar mistake again.
Let's talk about President Putin as well, Anthony, here, the other man dominating the front pages this morning. And Joe Biden, fascinating, seeing him saying what he did yesterday and then having to backtrack, the White House backtracking so quickly afterwards.
Well, I think it's deeply embarrassing that they did have to backtrack in that way, because it was obvious they were contradicting what he'd said quite clearly and plainly. He believes that passionately, and I think that almost every single leader in Europe feels the same way. There is going to be no peace while Putin is still in power. So from that point of view, it's perfectly logical. On the other hand, when you start talking of regime change, particularly of a country as important as Russia, you are into very dangerous waters.
Absolutely. You've studied Russia in huge detail. You're very famous for your book that you wrote, Stalingrad. You've got a new book coming out which focuses on a very turbulent time in Russian history between 1917 and 1921. Putin himself, I know I've seen articles you've written, your view is he has not learnt the lessons of history.
He certainly hasn't. I mean, the trouble is he has a distorted version of history, and he's obsessed by it, especially with the Second World War and the role of the Soviet Union. And he believes passionately that the world has not respected Russia in the way that it should, considering their sacrifices during that particular period. But militarily, he's still locked in the past. I mean, he sends in his tanks without infantry support. They make exactly the same mistakes that actually they made in the attack on Berlin in 1945. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, they were promised that they would be liberating the country. And then these soldiers find they're being cursed and they're out of fuel and they're starving. So it's one of the most extraordinary disasters, military disasters, really, of the modern era.
And there's a lot of talk today in the papers about whether or not it is the beginning of the end, whether or not Russia's military can succeed, or whether it is actually going to fail.
You're absolutely right. I think we've got to be very careful. There's been a certain amount of, shall we say, I think, excessive optimism that we're about to see the total collapse of the Russian army. Now, that might happen. It's certainly possible because of the appalling morale and the state of the troops. But on the other hand, there is always the possibility that by bringing in more troops, by redeploying, they could trap a large part of the Ukrainian army in the eastern part of the country. And that would give him the chance of saying, well, we've at least established or we've achieved a large measure of what we set out to do. So I think we should watch this one fairly carefully before coming to too clear an idea.
Yeah, Victoria, I mean, we're a month into this now, something so most people never thought would happen in the first place, but it is very, very difficult to know which way it's going to go.
Absolutely. I mean, you're dealing with a complete madman. I thought it was interesting today that Liz Truss, in the Sunday Telegraph interview that she did, she was almost offering him an incentive by saying, look, sanctions could potentially end if he withdraws, in contrast to Joe Biden, who's probably just escalated this thing with his poor choice of words.
Were you surprised about the scenario, what happened in Warsaw? And also, I mean, it all happened, the extraordinary backdrop to that all as well, wasn't it? It was when Lviv in western Ukraine was suddenly hit by missiles. You've got President Biden 150 miles away, and these dramatic pictures that we hadn't seen of smoke rising behind all the correspondents who are standing in western Ukraine, which until now has been pretty safe.
Certainly felt like a warning shot, didn't it? Biden's words were staggering, really. It's not the first time he's gone off-piste and ad-libbed, and the White House are then furiously trying to backtrack on what he's just said.
Is President Putin a man who could climb down?
He may find that there is absolutely no option. But on the other hand, what people were hoping for perhaps was some form of palace coup or whatever to remove him. There's certainly great anger within the FSB, within the Internal Security Service, which has been blamed for the disaster. Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, suddenly disappears. I mean, we're slightly back to Soviet days where, you know, when there was an embarrassment, a minister was sort of sent off to the sanatorium just to get them out of the way. But we don't really know what's going on within the Kremlin. But at the same time, they're very, very unhappy. And that actually makes Putin even more dangerous.
Victoria just said, you know, a madman there. I mean, you studied him in great detail. People have, in the papers recently, have been saying, is he sick? What's wrong with him? What do you think?
Well, there's been lots of speculation about his state of health. I mean, you can see the effect of the steroids on his face and all the rest of it. But whether he is seriously ill and this is sort of a last desperate gamble, we don't know. But I think that we're going to see probably in the next couple of weeks some pretty dramatic developments.
Victoria, let's talk about the cost of living, which is also in a lot of the papers. I can't find out if it's under here or not. But plenty of coverage, including in The Sun, where Rishi Sunak has written a big piece for you.
That's right. He's responding today to his spring statement. There's been an awful lot of criticism over it. It's rare that a spring statement would come out, and still by Sunday it's dominating the front pages with people talking about what more can he do to help people. I think the Treasury will be quite surprised at the level of anger that there's been since the statement. On the one hand, they will think we cannot fix everything, governments can't do that. But on the other hand, I'm sure they would have focus grouped a lot of these policies way before they were decided upon, and will be perhaps surprised at how badly some of them have gone down.
That's what the Sunday Times is saying this morning, isn't it, in their piece? And they're saying that word is that people are more worried about cost of living than they were about the pandemic, and that has surprised people inside Downing Street. That's right. I mean, the letters I get all the time, letters and emails and calls, is about people who cannot afford to put their heating on. And a lot of people feel that he should have done more to help people. He's obviously cut petrol tax, but should he have done VAT on heating and so on, people are talking about today. Or was he holding something back so that when the actual price cap rises again in the autumn, he has something left to give? Yeah, I'm sure that's what he will be doing. He will see it as a longer term process, but a lot of the help doesn't kick in until July, so it's a long way to go for some people. So it was interesting that all the papers today are speculating about what more he is going to do, as if it's a given he is going to do some more. And let's finish with Russia and Ukraine, Anthony. Do you think, you've studied Russian history, as I said, in huge depth, and it has been through some enormously tumultuous periods of time. Do you think that this is a war that is going to go on for years now?
No, I don't think it'll go on for years, if only from the point of view of the state of the Russian economy and the effect of sanctions. But it's going to get nastier before it ends, I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the real danger is whether Putin feels he's been pushed to the edge and therefore has to take some crazy gamble. I mean, they've been talking about a tactical nuclear weapon and all the rest of it. They're almost certainly going to use chemical weapons on So it's very, very hard at this particular stage. But when it comes to it, I think that we will see eventually a Russian withdrawal with an attempt to secure the whole of the eastern end of Ukraine and claim that as some sort of victory.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me this morning to look through the papers. Anthony and Victoria, thank you. And if you want to have more insight into Vladimir Putin and what drives the Russian president, the documentary maker Norma Percy's four-part series called Putin, Russia and the West covers his rise to power and is being shown again on Wednesday on BBC4 at 9 o'clock. You can also watch the whole series on iPlayer. Now, the clocks have gone forward. Spring is here, although the sun seems to have gone. Susan Powell, good morning.
Good morning. It looks like the weather's taking a step backwards, doesn't it, Sophie? We've got quite a large bank of fog at the moment across central and eastern England. Here's the City of London at the moment. You can just about make out Tower Bridge in the background. It's a mixture of dense, grey, low cloud and fog that's drifted in from the North Sea overnight. It's a pretty coherent area. We could see some clearer skies, perhaps getting into East Anglia and the southeast later on today. But I think a lot of cloud lingering across the Midlands, across to the Wash, is really going to peg our temperatures back here in contrast to recent days. Where we do have the sun, though, we're still looking at highs this afternoon of the mid to high teens. Clearer skies in the southeast overnight bring the promise of some fog returning to the M25 area for first thing Monday. I think this cloud will lower again through the night as well, quite foggy, murky across parts of the Midlands, northern England to start the new week. Elsewhere, clear skies, pockets of frost as we get Monday underway, but actually a lot of sunshine to come. And through the day, we should see more sunshine through the Midlands and East Anglia than we will today. A bit more cloud perhaps drifting into southern counties of England through the afternoon. Thanks to the return of the sunshine, the return of some warmth, but make the most of that because I think this graphic really is a very clear illustration of what's to come for the week ahead. We're going to lose that mild Atlantic air, and by the end of the week, we're all going to be plunged back into the Arctic air. So some big changes to come, Sophie.
Oh no, I just got used to the
Spring's
sunshine.
not quite set yet,
I
is
thought
it?
it was summer. Now you're telling me it's winter again. Thank you very much. Now, it is extraordinary to think that it is exactly 2 years ago that we first went into a coronavirus lockdown. Think back to that moment when normal life suddenly stopped. The shock of it, the disbelief and the fear. In a matter of hours, our towns and cities were suddenly deserted as everyone was told to stay at home. I still had to come to work, running in every day at lunchtime, which is when I took these photos. This was Regent Street. I had it all to myself. In Oxford Street, normally packed with shoppers, there were more pigeons than people, and public transport was for key workers only. I was even stopped by the police, who were checking that I had good reason to be out on the streets. Well, it seems a world away now. And yet we have more cases of COVID today than we did back then. And we do, of course, have the vaccine as well. So far fewer people in hospital. Does it mean COVID doesn't matter anymore? The BBC's medical editor, Fergus Walsh, has been following it all closely right from the very start. And he's with me now. A lot of people have got COVID right now.
Yeah, we're in the midst, Sophie, of the biggest wave of the pandemic. But you wouldn't think it if you go out on the streets now, packed. 4.3 million people, that's the estimate the ONS have for the number of people in the UK who had COVID last week. 1 in 16 in England and Wales, 1 in 11 in Scotland, driven by this subvariant of Omicron, BA2. And if we look at the cases, we used to have them on the 6 and 10 o'clock news
every day in huge detail.
This shows the last 6 months, a big peak in January, and then this daily figure of 77,000, completely unreliable because fewer people are testing now. And from 1st of April, with some exceptions, free tests are gone. I reckon that in the past 4 months since Omicron arrived, something like 1 in 3 people in the UK will have got Omicron. So an extraordinary amount of COVID around, driven in the past month by BA2, but also by the lifting of restrictions and more people mixing, less working from home.
But there are more and more people in hospital. Those numbers are going up, though it's not anything like the levels we saw before.
Yeah, we can look at the hospital figures. There are more people in hospital. This shows the last few months, 17,440. Now, at the peak in January 2021, it was more than 40,000.
I remember it.
And in Scotland now, there are more COVID patients in hospital than at any time in the pandemic. But there's a big but coming. More than half of COVID patients in hospital are actually admitted for something else. They're tending to spend much less time in hospital than they were, and they're getting less ill. And if we can show that by looking at the number of patients on ventilators, the very sickest COVID patients. It's now 302. You can see how much it's fallen. At the peak, there were more than 4,000. Still somewhere between 800 and 1,000 COVID-related deaths each week, but at the peak, there were more than 1,000 every day.
The question, though, is what impact it has and whether it matters anymore. And even though we have fewer, as you said, 40,000, I remember that, in hospital, huge numbers at the peak, in the height of all this in terms of hospital numbers, we're still now climbing up to 20,000 again. And given waiting lists and given the pressure on the NHS, is that having an impact still?
Yeah, absolutely. It really does matter, because although most people will get either very mild illness or cold or flu-like symptoms for a few days, a minority do get very ill, as we see from the hospital numbers. Now, it's a real credit to the vaccines that they are providing such a level of protection, but just simply the number of school children off at the moment, more than 200,000 off last week, a lot of essential workers off as well. So yeah, it's very much still an issue, and with the NHS facing record waiting lists there, it's having to cope with a huge number of COVID patients, although not that many in intensive care. But that's why it's really, really important to protect the most vulnerable. And the rollout of the spring booster, more than 7 million people, the over 75s and 500 million immunosuppressed, they're now getting access to this spring booster. And the over 50s probably will get boosters again in the autumn. So we're going to see a round of boosters coming maybe every year.
Fergus Walsh, thank you very much for putting that all in context for us. Well, the BA2 variant is spreading around the world, and America's most prominent doctor, Anthony Fauci, is the man who has advised both President Trump and President Biden during the pandemic, a controversial figure at times. I asked him if we are about to see a new worldwide wave of the virus.
Well, we certainly will be seeing increase in cases. What's going on in Europe and the UK has not yet hit the United States. We still are having the decrement of cases, of hospitalizations and deaths. A little bit less sharp decline than a week or two ago, but we fully expect, because the same conditions which appear to be driving the resurgence of Omicron, particularly the BA2 sub-lineage variant of Omicron, is a combination of three things. It's the greater transmissibility of the BA2. It's the relaxation of restrictions, particularly in the context of indoor masking in congregate settings, and also the fact that immunity, due to both vaccination as well as people who've been previously infected, tends to wane with SARS-CoV-2, particularly with Omicron. So it is quite correct that we're seeing increases in cases in most countries throughout the world. The important thing that we need to keep an eye on is that it doesn't appear to be associated with any increase in severity in the form of increased hospitalizations. And for example, in the UK, they find that there is no increase in the utilization of intensive care unit beds or in the all-cause mortality.
Because in the UK, just in the past week alone, there has been a significant rise, and we're reaching near record levels with people with COVID. 1 in 16 people in England had it last week alone. Are you saying we don't need to worry about it anymore?
No, I'm not saying that at all. Whenever you get any surges, particularly of this virus that has given us so much trouble, I would never say, don't worry about it. What I'm saying is that we have to observe it carefully. We are seeing this uptick, and I believe there is an explanation for the uptick.
So should people be wearing masks again?
I don't think this is going to be a unidimensional decision. I think each individual country, depending upon the circumstances in that country, and it ranges from everything, is that what is the percentage of the population that's vaccinated and boosted? What is the percentage that you estimate have already been infected? What is the hospital capacity in a particular country in case there is an increase in the need for hospitalization?
Do you see the foreseeable future as one of regular vaccination programs?
I would not be surprised, even though there's no guarantee, that we would require an intermittent boosting somewhat similar to what we see about the requirement of a flu shot each year.
Is it the right time for the UK to be getting rid of free testing?
I understand from some of my colleagues in the UK that they would like to continue the availability of free testing, but the resources are scarce. I mean, obviously, when you have a situation where you're trying to appropriately follow what the pattern of the outbreak is, testing is important. It's important not only to know where we're going with the dynamics of the outbreak, but it's important when people are infected, even though they're asymptomatic, it would be important for them to isolate themselves according to the guidelines to prevent them from infecting other people.
Are people going to move into a moment now where they can live life as usual, or could some variant come along and take us back to where we were, to lockdowns, to masks?
Well, I don't want to use the word lockdowns. That has a charged element to it, but I believe that we must keep our eye on the pattern of what we're seeing with infections. Right now, I'll take the United States, for example, the cases continue to go down, the hospitalizations go down, and the deaths go down. We are going in a gradual way towards what we all hope will be normal. Having said that, we need to be prepared for the possibility that we would have another variant that would come along. And if things change and we do get a variant that does give us an uptick in cases and hospitalization, we should be prepared and flexible enough to pivot towards going back, at least temporarily, to a more rigid type of a restriction, such as requiring masks indoor.
I'm interested in your reluctance to use the word lockdown. Do you think 2 years on that they were worth it, or were they too severe?
You know, I don't think we're ever going to be able to determine what the right balance is. I think the restrictions, if you want to use that word, which I tend to shy away from, lockdown, there's certainly prevented a lot of infections, prevented a lot of hospitalizations, and prevented a lot of deaths. There's no doubt about that. Obviously, when you do have that kind of restriction on society, there are unintended negative consequences, particularly in children who are not allowed to go to school, in the psychological and mental health aspects it has on children, in the economic stress that it puts on society in general, on individual families. Obviously, those are negative consequences that are unintended. One has to look at the balance of lives saved, hospitalizations avoided.
Are we ever going to find out the truth of where COVID-19 came from?
Well, you know, given the fact that there are such restrictions on ability to really investigate it, I'm not sure. Right now, the data are accumulating over the last few months, much more heavily weighted that this was a natural occurrence from an animal species. However, having said that, we must keep an open mind as to all possibilities of how that might have emerged.
We spoke to one of the WHO investigators who'd been to Wuhan to investigate how the virus started, and they were prevented from seeing key details and from speaking to key people. Why do you think the Chinese government did that?
You know, I don't want to create any or mention any disparaging remarks about that, but the Chinese are very closed in a way of being very reluctant, particularly when you have a disease that evolves in their country. They become extremely secretive, even though there's no reason to be secretive. I think they were very concerned and maybe embarrassed that the virus evolved from their country, but there's nothing wrong with that. So when they see something evolving in their own country, they tend to have a natural reflex of not necessarily covering things up, but not being very open and transparent.
But you said very publicly, right at the start of the pandemic, that you thought it was a direct result of the wet markets. How could you have been so certain so early on when you knew so little about the virus?
Well, I was never certain so early on. I have always kept an open mind. But when you look at the circumstances of the evolution, the similarity between that and the SARS-CoV-1 from 2002, 2003, I said, as did many other virologists who are very experienced in that the most likely etiology was a jumping species from an animal to the human.
Other scientists here as well signed an open letter in February 2020 saying that they very strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Was the scientific community too quick to dismiss the possibility that it could have come from a laboratory?
Well, I don't think they were dismissing it. I think it's been misinterpreted. Everyone has always kept an open mind, but the circumstances of how this evolved, the epidemiology, as well as the similarity with what we know was a jumping of species from an animal to the human, had many scientists, including myself, say again, and I have to repeat because I see the direction you're going, no one ever said they were absolutely certain. I certainly never said that. I told you what I thought the most likely origin is. And many highly qualified scientists agreed with that. But we still must keep an open mind. And I will repeat it for you today, that we must keep an open mind about this.
Is it just a coincidence that there is a huge coronavirus laboratory in Wuhan?
Well, I mean, it is not at all surprising that there's a research lab in there. The Chinese were trying to figure out, and did successfully figure out, what the original etiology was of SARS-CoV-1. And the very fact that we did have a SARS-CoV-1 made it very, very clear that there would be a possibility that we would have another pandemic outbreak from the animal-human interface. So it makes very good sense that the Chinese would be studying this in earnest to try and find out how you could ultimately prevent the occurrence of another coronavirus outbreak, which in fact we did have.
Since COVID began, we have had more problems in winter. Things have got worse in the winter. Do you expect this winter to be straightforward, or do you expect it to be difficult again?
You know, I think it's really unpredictable. This virus has fooled us so often. We've had multiple waves, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, Alpha, Beta, Delta, Omicron. We really don't know. And I think anyone who says they're going to predict with any certainty what's going to happen in the winter, I think is a bit of a stretch. I think we just have to do the best we can to prevent this. And the easiest way to do that is to get as many people vaccinated as we possibly can, and to get boosters for those who are eligible for boosters.
Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
That was the Chief Medical Advisor to the US President, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Labour's Jonathan Ashworth. Good morning. We're going to talk about the spring statement in a moment, but first let's talk about COVID and school children in particular, because Dr. Fauci is saying there that lockdowns had unintended negative consequences, particularly in children who are not allowed to go to school. Do you think, in hindsight, do you think school closures were a mistake?
We were always very clear that school closures had to be absolutely the last resort. We never wanted to see schools closed. It was UNICEF in the pandemic who I think said that children may not be the face of the pandemic, but they're amongst its biggest victims. And throughout the whole of that pandemic, even though when schools did close, and that was the recommendations from our medical experts, given where we were with the COVID at the time, we in the Labour Party were always pushing the government to go further and faster, to make sure that there was support in place for those children who are losing out on their education. And actually, even today, we still don't have the procedures, the measures in place to properly support children catch up on their missed learning in that period.
You say that you thought it should be a last resort, and you didn't want schools to close. But I mean, your then Shadow Education Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, was saying in May and June that the government must commit to not opening schools unless they meet 5 specific tests. She said that twice. She was very adamant that schools should stay closed unless they could prove otherwise.
You know, we always wanted schools to stay open where they could. There was a period at the start of the pandemic in 2020 where we knew less about the virus and there was a concern about infection rates in schools. But also, by the way, it was also that public sector workers, the teachers and so on who run the schools, they were obviously getting sick and were taking time off. So there was a practical issue around schools staying open at that point. But throughout the whole of that process, I think Keir Starmer, and he actually got some criticism from people, he was saying, what's the plan to get schools reopened? And then when we had the Delta surge, Keir Starmer actually on this show, or the precursor show, the Mar show, was saying, look, we need to be supporting schools to stay open as long as possible.
Let's talk about the spring statement and cost of living. There were eye-watering amounts of money we heard this week. The amount of interest that the UK is going to be paying on its debt alone is going to cost £83 billion. I mean, that is almost as much as we spend on education. It's twice as much as we spend on defence. Can the government afford to borrow any more money?
Well, look, the reason why we've got this problem with borrowing is because for 12 long years
I'm not asking about the problem. I'm asking whether or not the government can afford to spend more money.
Well, it is, in some ways, I will answer the question, because the debt and the borrowing is a reflection of 12 years of hacking away at the roots of growth.
That's happened, whatever.
But if you had better growth under those 12 years, we'd be in a better position now. We're in a better position now to deal with the pressures upon public services. You've got to ask yourself, why is it after 12 years of hacking away at growth, we have public services stretched, the highest
But that's
tax
not what I'm
burden,
asking you. That's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking whether or not a government can afford to spend or to borrow more money when it's already having to spend £83 billion just paying off interest on its debt.
But what a government can do is make different sets of choices.
I'm just wondering whether you think that the government can borrow more money now, though.
No, Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor, set out very clear fiscal rules which should be put in place in order to govern borrowing. So you can borrow to invest in infrastructure, and we want to invest in transforming our green economy so we can invest in renewables. But of course, you also want to get your debt and your borrowing down, which is also one of our fiscal rules as well. Which is why, for example, you also need to make different choices around taxation. So the Chancellor has decided not to impose a windfall tax on the big gas and oil producers, even though they're making bumper profits. The consequence of that is he's not able to give struggling households support with their bills.
And what do you do then for people who, let's say, got less out of this mini budget, this mini statement than others, people on benefits, people on pensions, which are due to rise by 3% lower than inflation? How much would a Labour government increase them by?
But you say lower than inflation, that's actually a real terms cut. It actually translates to the biggest cut in the pension in real terms for 50 years.
But that's not what I'm asking again.
We're seeing a big cut in universal credit.
That's not what I'm asking you.
People are supposed to be worse off as a consequence of the decisions that Rishi Sunak has made.
That's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you how much a Labour government would increase that by.
Well, we actually opposed the government when they broke their promise to pensioners. They're supposed to get a triple lock increase. Boris Johnson promised that in his manifesto. He actually broke his promise on that.
Again. How much would a Labour government increase them by?
Well, Rachel Reeves, ahead of the mini budget last week, said the government should be looking at bringing forward an increase in the pension and an increase in support like universal credit. Because what we've got at the moment is the universal credit, benefits for disabled people, the pension is going to be cut in real terms because they've pegged that decision to September. Whereas this coming September...
So how much should it be then? What should the increase be?
Well, this coming September, inflation will be much higher, around about 8%. Now, you could have brought some of that increase for next year into this year. Rishi Sunak refused to do that. Presumably, I don't know if that's because he's callous or incompetent, or maybe it's because he's not going to honour that increase in benefits and the pension this September. Perhaps you should ask Nadhim Zahawi.
Or because it would cost £4.5 billion. You'd take it up to 6% and it's already £4.5 billion more.
But the point is, at the moment, that is a commitment from the government to increase the pension and benefits this September by whatever inflation is. You could have brought that increase this coming September into now. Now, the government refused to do that, even though it means 1.3 million people going into poverty, many pensioners in poverty, and 500,000 children. It may be that the reason they didn't do that is they're going to break their promise on that commitment, just like they've broken their promise on the triple lock.
Let me ask you something, a very different subject, about Prince William, the tour of the Caribbean. What did you think of the pictures of the Cambridges on their Caribbean tour? Some people say that they thought they looked like a reminder of colonialism. What did you think?
Well, I mean, they've been on their tour. I know they've talked about the future of the Commonwealth. I think the Commonwealth will endure. I mean, I'm not. It's up to the royal household how they organise their visits.
Would you like to see Prince William lead the Commonwealth?
Well, yeah. I mean, he's that. Yeah, I would. But obviously, individual nations will make their own judgments on these.
Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much. Now, for the first time in 3 years, school children across the UK are going to sit exams this summer. Children are the least likely to get seriously ill from the virus, but the lockdowns have affected them more than most others. The pandemic has caused huge disruption to their education. For months, millions of children were forced to stay at home as schools all over the UK closed their doors. And even now, despite no restrictions, huge numbers are off school because of COVID. Well, I'm joined by the Education Secretary, Nadhim Zahawi. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start in general. 1 in 16 people in England and Wales have COVID. Northern Ireland, 1 in 17. Scotland, 1 in 11. Is it a problem?
Well, we have to keep a very close eye on the infection rates in the education system. About 9% of teachers and support staff are off with absent from school, partly because of COVID. The best way you will know that we protect the country as we transition this virus from pandemic to endemic is through vaccination, and the Secretary of State for Health has announced the 4th booster jab for the most vulnerable. I continue to work obviously with the sector, with the front line, to make sure we keep an eye on what's happening. The great news is, and this is because of teachers, because of support staff, 99.9% of schools are open. They did brilliantly through Omicron, did brilliantly to reopen after Christmas. And of course, we want to continue to make sure that children are in education, because Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner, conducted a survey of 500,000 children. I was at a school last week in Totteridge Academy. The children said to me unanimously, it was terrible being at home and having to do online learning. We know it had an impact on their education, but also on their mental well-being, which is why I think I will do everything in my power to make sure schools remain open and be, I hope, the first major economy in the world to demonstrate to the world how you transition this virus from pandemic to endemic.
Can you guarantee that schools will never close like that again?
Well, I will do everything in my power to make sure they don't, by making sure that we continue those sort of the first line of defence is, of course, vaccination. The second line is the therapeutics and the antivirals. And we make sure that we continue to support the front line. Directors of public health locally work very close with schools. I speak to them regularly because I think they do a brilliant job working with schools. If we have local outbreaks, we have a local outbreak plan for that. But I think it was, look, I've been on record as saying I think it was a mistake that we close schools for the majority of children. Of course, schools remained open. It's worth reminding ourselves that teachers and support staff were in school, making sure the children of the frontline NHS workers, those children that are most vulnerable, stayed in school. But the bulk of children have had a terrible time being out of school.
It's going to be difficult to keep track of outbreaks, isn't it, given testing is being scaled right back?
Well, we'll say a bit more on testing on the 1st of April, of course, as to what the policy is. But the most important thing... Meaning
what, there could be more testing in schools?
As I say, we'll outline what the policy is on testing. The important thing to remember is we have very high rates of antibodies in the population. And, of course, because the vaccination programme has been so successful in this country, both in terms of the initial vaccination programme that I was a part of the team responsible for, but also the booster campaign has been one of the most successful in the world, and now, of course, continuing to protect people. So I'm confident that the profession, support staff are in a strong place. It's not over. The virus still is with us. And just listen to Anthony Fauci saying the same thing. So we just have to be careful. On Monday, I will publish my white paper on how we're going to deliver a strong school with great teachers for every child in our country. And that's a commitment that I make to the viewers who are thinking about their children's education today.
Do you know how many children right now are off school because of COVID? What are the latest figures?
So it's around 200,000 school children who are off school. It has ticked up a little bit, of course, because of infection.
It trebled in sort of a fortnight, didn't it?
Because infection rates are high, but we have, if not broken, we've weakened the link between infection rates and, of course, severe infection and hospitalization because of the vaccination, and because, of course, those who do suffer from severe infection have the antivirals and therapeutics that Sajid Javid has had the foresight to purchase for the United Kingdom.
For people and parents who are worried about their children missing so much school, which they have done over the last couple of years, if their child has COVID, should they be sending them to school?
Well, if your child has COVID, no, they shouldn't be sending them to school. I think people have been actually very good exercising common sense as to how to deal with Omicron and with the virus. And of course, teachers and support staff have been brilliant at doing this, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart for what they do. The good news is that 99.9% of schools are open. That demonstrates that actually the sector is pretty adept now as to how they use both testing kits and, of course, make sure that teachers are protected with vaccination and those children get that protection that are eligible to be vaccinated as well.
A lot of the decision making, though, is being left with the school as to whether or not they can accept children who... I mean, a lot of children, they don't know whether they've got COVID or not, do they? So schools are being left to make that decision. Should schools turn away children who they think have COVID?
So teachers have done a brilliant job, and I trust the teachers and school leaders. Why do I say that to you? Because obviously there's COVID, but there's also other respiratory children's viruses around. I've got a 9-year-old, and there's a lot of others, chickenpox, in schools. And I think the responsible thing to do is if a child is unwell, for them to stay at home, for them obviously to then test if they have COVID, and then not to come into
and
school
schools
until they recover.
are in there and should have the right just to say to children,
and they do.
Go home.
The schools have been really good in the way they've shown real leadership and taken responsibility to make sure that education is protected. We know from Rachel D'Souza's work, 500,000 children responded to her survey, that not just the education element of this was difficult, but also the mental well-being was impacted by school closures.
It's not just children who are off, a lot of teachers are off. We spoke at the very start of this year, there were just under 9% of teachers off. There are just over 9% of teachers off at the moment. How are children expected to get a decent education if this is just going to keep going?
Well, again, teachers have done a brilliant... I've got 461,000 teachers who are doing an amazing job on the front line. 99.9% of schools are open. We have to cope with this. This is about learning how to live with COVID. And as I said, the first line of defence is the vaccine, it's the therapeutic and antivirals, and making sure that people are sensible in the way they behave when there are local outbreaks. We have a local outbreak plan. So all these things are in place, and I couldn't do my job today without what the front line, what teachers and support staff. Never forget the support staff, because when I visit schools, it's those brilliant people who, for example, in secondary schools, we asked them to conduct that first week of testing for children when we came back after Christmas with Omicron, and they did a brilliant job getting 99.9% of schools open and remain open.
Which you keep saying, but that is open, completely open. I mean, there are partial closures going on all over the country, aren't they? So in a way, it's a misleading figure.
It's still an incredible number, but also an incredible sort of reflection on the strength of our teaching profession and the support staff in schools. Of course, every country...
It doesn't give a particularly clear or an entirely clear picture of the situation,
of course
does it? It sounds like there are no problems at all, when we know that there are a lot of children off, there are a lot of teachers off, and there are classes which are just not at school.
I've just spent several minutes saying to you that this thing is not over. We have to continue to be very conscious that we're going to have this virus around for a number of years. I don't know how long, but we've got to make preparations to be able to live with the virus, which we are making. So this Secretary of State is in no way trying to sort of sugarcoat any of this.
How long do you think it will be before a child can go through the school system without being affected by this virus at all?
Well, I can't answer that, because the virus will have variants, and what we've got to make sure is actually we have the wherewithal. We have the vaccines, the therapeutics, the genome sequencing capability, all these things, and of course the local outbreak plans. But teachers have done a tremendous job to date, which is, it's allowed me to be able to publish my white paper on Monday of how I see us delivering a strong school with great teachers for every child in our country. I'm very fond of talking about my own background of coming here at the age of 11, not being able to speak a word of English, having to sort of string together a few words I knew in my head to try and participate, because by the time I made the sentence, subject matter moved on. My early teachers saying they thought I had maybe some learning difficulties, which is why the Send Green paper, which will publish on Tuesday after the school's white paper, will knit together a system in mainstream that does brilliantly for SEND children and specialist places for SEND children as well. So it's a big endeavour to complete the journey. We're about to announce our 10,000th academy. That's real scale. The evidence is clear that a family of schools that's really tightly managed, really well supported, especially through COVID, has delivered better educational outcomes for their children. So strong, and I underline the word strong, multi-academy trusts is the infrastructure that we need to complete and deliver, and that's what my white paper will do. And we're challenging ourselves to make sure that at the moment only 2/3 of primary school children complete primary school with the ability to read, write and do maths to an acceptable standard. That in the white paper will be a target to reach 90% by 2030 of primary school children. We have a target at secondary schools for the average GCSE.
You're looking at what is going ahead in the future. I'm interested in the inquiry into COVID and what it will look at, because there is this inquiry that's about to start into how COVID was handled. There are no plans to look at the impact that it had on children. Are you going to change that?
Well, the inquiry team are consulting as to what they should be focusing on. I certainly think a focus on the impact on children, especially on their mental well-being and, of course, their educational outcomes is really important.
So why isn't it even in the draft terms of reference?
Well,
the word children isn't even mentioned.
They're consulting on the draft terms of reference, and I think many, including the chairman of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, has made representations to say that should be included.
And you think it should be changed as well?
I would be open to that. I think it's important to learn the lessons. As Secretary of State for Education, I can tell you, the evidence on both the impact on education and health and well-being has been substantial, which is why I said it's a mistake that we close schools, and we have to learn from those mistakes.
And extraordinary, then, therefore, that the word children isn't even mentioned at the moment in the draft terms of reference.
Hence why we do things properly in this country, and we consult on the draft terms of reference, and I'm sure the team will look at that very carefully.
How many children have dropped out of school during COVID and just not come back?
So there is the number of 100,000 lost children to education. Some people put the figure higher than that, where we see an impact, whether it's anxiety or otherwise, on them. What I'm doing on that is two things. One, I've got a task force, an attendance task force that's working with schools, with local authorities to make sure we learn from the best. Because
this is the Attendance Alliance.
Correct. So sometimes you get two schools, similar demographics, similar postcodes, one doing really well on attendance. I went to Hammersmith Academy, great leader, Gary Kinniston, has done a brilliant job on attendance and behaviour in his schools. Another school
the Attendance Alliance is about talking what to do, isn't it? It's not about doing it.
So it's about evidencing what to do and then sharing the evidence with other schools.
I mean, arguably it needs to be done now, doesn't it?
We're doing that, literally every single day we focus on this. The other thing I'm doing is we've never had in our country a register of children and understand where they are in the education system. And we're going to introduce a register to make sure that we know where children are. And I think that's really important. Now, there are some families who choose to home educate, and they do a brilliant job. I've got families in my own constituency who do a brilliant job on home education. But there are many children that I worry about, which is why I think the register plus the Attendance Alliance work will put us in a good place, because we really need to deal with this. Every single child who's missing education is missing out on that opportunity, that levelling up.
And it's also
that we talk about.
The most vulnerable as well. And there was that horrific case of Arthur Lavinia Hughes, which a lot of people remember, and the fear that children who have been lost during this pandemic and have not been at school are not being watched. And the fear is that that kind of abuse could happen to other children. It could still be happening to children who aren't in school.
Which is why I've got Josh McAllister doing a children's social care review. So with the school's white paper, the SEND green paper and the children's social care review, I've got an opportunity for the first time, certainly in my lifetime in Parliament, to knit together a system that really does protect the most vulnerable and make sure they're in school. Arthur actually was registered in school, but there are some children who aren't at the moment registered in school, and we need to know where they are, which is why I'm introducing a national register.
Let me just ask you about another story that's been very much in the media, in the papers of late, Child Q. The report into this case of Child Q, this was in London, in Hackney, a 15-year-old black schoolgirl who her teacher thought she smelled of cannabis. She failed to find any drugs on her, so the child was strip searched by 2 female police officers without an appropriate adult present. Should any child be strip searched in school?
It's appalling what happened. I am reviewing what our guidelines, our policies are on this. No child should have been exposed to that sort of trauma in any way. The school has apologised. They have said they didn't know or realise that the child was being strip searched. It's important that we take this very seriously. And I know the police have apologised as well on this. So the parents weren't even contacted, which I find hugely distressing, which is why I've asked my team to review the policy on this, and I'll be saying more about this very soon.
Was it racism?
I don't know, because I don't know what drove those police officers. There's an investigation, obviously. The police have apologised, but I think it was appalling. Parents, everyone. You don't have to have a child to be shocked that a child is allowed to be strip searched in an environment which is meant to be a protective environment. School is a protective environment for children. Hence why I've asked my team to make sure that we review the policies, and I'll be saying more, but I will certainly be looking at putting out much tougher guidelines on this.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and Russia, and President Biden yesterday saying that Vladimir Putin, this man, cannot remain in power. Do we need regime change for this war to end?
That's up to the Russian people, and it is only the Russian people that can make that decision. I suspect most of them are pretty fed up with Putin and his cronies and the illegal war. There are clearly evidence of war crimes being committed in the Ukraine, targeting civilian areas. The Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, is working with the International Criminal Court.
So was the American president wrong to say it?
Well, no, I think what the American president, as the White House has made clear, was talking about is that Putin's illegal invasion
didn't
has
sound
to
like that,
end.
did it?
And ultimately, it is up to the Russian people. I think there's been a huge miscalculation. Not only is he killing innocent people in the Ukraine, but he has damaged the Russian people, who many of which have relatives, have friends who are Ukrainian, and their lives and livelihoods have been blighted. There's a huge movement in Russia, a Stop the War movement, and I suspect it will be the Russian people who'll make that decision.
And a last question on Prince William and his statement on the return from his tour of the Caribbean. Do you understand why people saw those pictures and of the Cambridges on their tour and thought that it was a reminder of colonialism?
No, I don't. I have to tell you for why. Because there's a picture, I think it was Raheem Sterling, shaking hands with the same kids. Yet it was celebrated as being a way of engaging with young people. Yet obviously there was some criticism of William and Catherine doing the same thing. I think actually Prince William has been very wise in his statements and his words. I tell you for why, because I suspect making sure that it is the people of the Commonwealth of Jamaica and other countries who decide whether they want to be part of this family of nations will strengthen the Commonwealth. And I think he's been very, very wise. And I think that what they represent is truly what is great of this wonderful country of ours.
Do you want to see Prince William lead the Commonwealth?
I absolutely want to see Prince William lead. I'd like, of course, to make sure that the Prince of Wales, who's done tremendous work in the Commonwealth, I've had the privilege recently of meeting him because he's interested in education. In apprenticeships in our country. He was interested in the T-levels, by the way, which I have on my lapel, which is a fusion between an apprenticeship and an A-level. Interested in disadvantage in our country and abroad is what makes him such a powerful advocate for the Commonwealth.
Nadhim Zahawi, thank you very much for joining me this morning. And that's it from us. Clive Murray will be here next Sunday. Do join him then. From all of us here, enjoy your Sunday morning. Goodbye.